As we consider the westward movement and the settlement of the frontier in the period after the Civil War, the first thing we have to think about are the pushes and the pulls. Certain things back east were pushing people to leave the east and move out west. Some of the things that pushed them, made them want to leave the east, would have been, well, one, the Civil War itself, getting away from the war, possibly avoiding the draft and military service. There would be the push for, once slavery ended, for some of the slaves to try to escape the segregation and the racism that they would find in the South. For some people, they might be pushed by debt, or maybe they had committed some crime and they were trying to escape to the West. Others would be pushed simply by the crowded conditions that they wanted to get away with, or all kinds of personal things in your life, like the death of a loved one, divorce, other type of problems, or in other cases, possibly some type of persecution for your group, whether it's religious, ethnic, whatever it might be. There's a number of things that might push people to leave the East and go west. But the West also had a lot of pulls that drew people to the West. There was all that land. There was all kinds of opportunities to try to make it rich, whether it be by land ownership, by trying to hunt for gold, by trying to open a business, by taking employment in one of the many growing industries out west. Also the adventure of it, to see that wide open land before it was gone, to be part of that westward movement. There were a number of things that drew people, the pulls that drew people out west. So today we're going to look at some of the features of this period, this area and the period that we know as the Old West. In this period after the Civil War, up through the close of the 19th century, we see the final civilization and settlement. Up before that, we had settled all the way up to the Mississippi. But the western parts of the country had yet to be settled. So one of the things that's going to draw people out west will be land itself. And in 1862, one of the big motivating factors to help draw people further out west is going to be the Homestead Act. If you moved to the Western Territories, much of the land was set aside where all you had to do was pay a small fee to file on the land. You could have up to 160 acres for your family. And all you had to do once you filed this claim was live there for 5 years and improve the land, build a home, start to farm, and then it would be yours. So this was a big opportunity to gain land. As the Transcontinental Railroad pushed further west, there had to be whistle stops along the way to take on water so that the engines could run, and to take on other supplies. And everywhere that there was a whistle stop, people would settle around that whistle stop because the train would come through and they could travel by train. They could ship their crops out by train. They could bring in supplies by train. And so everywhere the train went, that meant civilization followed, with towns growing up. And as we said, the Civil War is going to push a lot of people to head out west. So people are heading out there for the land itself. Another thing that's going to drive people or draw people out west is mining. Now, the first big rush for gold was in California in 1849. The California Gold Rush drew Americans from the east, and they just rushed right across the country, past all of the central part of the country, past the Great Plains, past the Rocky Mountains, and right out to that California coast to look for gold. Now, the people who really usually make it rich in the gold rush are not these thousands of miners that went out there. Most of them never found any gold. A few will find gold, but usually those that find gold, if you're a poor little guy with a burrow and a pickaxe and you discover gold in this mountains, you don't have the wherewithal to mine all that gold by yourself out of the mountain. And most of the time, people who did find a claim end up selling it off to some rich guy who gets richer by then organizing a mining operation and mining the mineral wealth. Many of the miners end up working in the mines because they went out there, found no gold, and ended up working in one of these boom towns where the mines where gold was discovered for low pay to make some rich guy richer. That was quite often the way things went. The people who did make a killing in the gold rush were people, for instance, like Levi Strauss. He heads out to San Francisco to provide supplies to the miners, and he brings with him a bunch of canvas for making tents. He thinks that'll be needed. But when he got out there, he discovered people needed more durable pants, and he used that canvas material for making pants, and Levi's were born. And he got rich off of that. A lot of people ended up opening stores and businesses and providing supplies to the miners, and they were often the ones that actually did well in this rush. But everywhere there was a rush for gold or silver, civilization followed. The next big rush is going to come in 1859 in the Nevada Territory. The Comstock lode is going to be, yes, they'll find gold, but mixed in with that gold, they're going to find tons of silver. In fact, in one little town, they kept finding this gray, ugly material that was in the way of the gold they were mining. There was so much of it, they paved the streets with it, and then they got it tested and found out, hey, that's silver. Well, that street got tore up overnight. But they found gold, they found silver. People rushed out there. Later, there's going to be gold rushes in Colorado. Later, there'll be a gold rush to the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. And eventually, the last big rush at the turn of the 20th century is going to be the Klondike. And you'll go north to Alaska to find the big gold that's up there. Well, of course, there's a lot of dangers if you are in the mining business, especially if you're working in a big industrial mine. Fire, flood, that's the one that creeps me out, the idea that you're mining around underground and you tap into an underground river and you all drown suddenly. That one creeps me out. Of course, there's the danger of poisonous gas that you might tap into. That's why they had the little canaries in a cage so that the thing would drop over dead if it breathed poisonous gas, and they would know, uh-oh, mine's filling with poison, we better get out. Cave-in, explosion, there's all kinds of dangers. It was a rough business. And just like we're going to see in the factories back east later on, oftentimes the owners of the mine had no responsibility to the miners should they get hurt. There was no workman's comp, no laws to protect them. So it's a rough business. But it did create industry out west and drew people to work in the mines. Now, the cattle industry is especially going to boom here in Texas. After the Civil War, those millions of Yankees up there were pretty hungry, and they would pay top dollar for beef. Now, the thing is, down here in Texas, we had longhorn cattle. They were wild animals the Spanish had brought in, and they had gotten loose, and they were breeding in the wild, and nobody owned them. You just go out there, throw a rope around them, drag them into San Antonio, you make $5. That's a week's wage. That's pretty darn good, selling that critter. But if you could sell that same animal in New York City, you'd get $25. That's a big markup. And that drew people to start the cattle industry down here in Texas. Would-be cattle barons, ranchers, they would hire a bunch of cowboys. They'd go up and round up this cattle. And what they wanted to do was ship it up north. The problem with that is the fastest way to ship anything is by railroad. But during the Civil War, them Yankees had ripped all the railroads out of the South, all the way to Texas, so that we could move soldiers and equipment down here. And that meant there were no railroads in Texas, so the nearest railroads were up there in Kansas. So that was the purpose of the cattle drives. They would drive cattle after they rounded them up there to Kansas to sell them in the cattle towns of the north, and then the cattle would be shipped on to markets in the north. Now, this creates those boom towns out west. You've got mining boom towns and you've got cattle towns. And both of these types of towns, number one, it's a market for the goods. Okay, whether it's gold, whether it's silver, whether it's cattle, you sell your commodity there. Then the workers, especially these cowboys that have been hired on, they've been spending the whole spring rounding up cattle and all summer driving them, and they've been around nothing but other cowboys. They get their entire year's wage all at once. And then before they head out to wherever they're going to go until next spring when they hire on as a cowboy on another ranch, they go into town, and the things they're going to look for in town, I don't have it on the list. First thing's a bath, actually. After they pay and get a bath and maybe a shave, then they're going to find a good place to eat food. After that, then they go to the saloons, where in the movies, that's where all the action happens. And yes, in the saloons, some are big and fancy, others are very small. Depends on the saloon, but they're going to be selling alcohol. There'll be some level of gambling. Some of the bigger saloons, it was like a casino in there. And there will be some opportunity to see women in there. The women might be barmaids, the women might be performers, a singer, a dancer, something like that. And in some cases, it might be prostitution. It depended on the town's laws and the size of the saloon as to what there might be. But here's the thing. You have a guy that's in there with his entire wage in his pocket. He's drinking and gambling or drinking and flirting with women. And other guys are doing the same thing, and violence can very quickly break out. So the Wild West towns really could be wild. That meant that you needed a good lawman to keep these cowboys under control. So that brings us to the other part of the Wild West, these famous lawmen and outlaws. Now, I've got a number of them on the slide here. I'm just going to mention 3 famous ones. But to give you an example, these lawmen, if you need a lawman to keep your town under control, you may not necessarily need the guy who's a law student, who's a fine, upstanding pillar of the community. You might need the rough fella who puts fear into the hearts of these cowboys and gets them in line. And so sometimes these Wild Western lawmen, they could be tough characters. And sometimes that line between lawman and outlaw would get blurred, as I'll tell you about here. Now, one of the most famous outlaws was a fellow named Jesse James. Jesse James was on the losing side in the Civil War. But worse than that, Jesse and Frank James and their friends, the Younger brothers, that was the name of the family, the Youngers, they had fought with Bloody Bill Anderson and William Quantrell. These were Confederate leaders that led out there in the fighting in Missouri and Kansas. And if you remember, that was some of the nastiest, ugliest fighting that had happened even before the Civil War. And they had not been branded real soldiers. They had been branded bushwhackers, murderers, criminals. And so when other Confederates went home after the war, these guys were branded criminals and hunted. And these guys have spent the last few years of their life laying ambushes for the enemy, using guns to survive. And when you brand them criminals and don't let them go home and farm, well, they take those skills and they turn to robbing banks and trains, which the local people in Missouri, and the part of Missouri they were from, didn't mind so much because it was those darn Yankees that owned the banks and foreclosed on their property and owned the trains. And they were kind of rooting for these guys, which helped them in hiding out. So Frank and Jesse and the Younger brothers, they would rob banks and trains up in Missouri very effectively. And then they would take their money and they would go hide in other states using an assumed name. The James brothers would go to Tennessee under the name of Howard, and they were fine, upstanding citizens, spending their ill-gotten gains there, going to church, getting married, raising kids. They were nice guys there. The Younger brothers came to my hometown of Waco, Texas, and we didn't know who they were at the time, but they were fine, upstanding pillars of the community, spending their money and getting along with everyone. And here's that example I'm talking about. These guys are murderers and killers, bank robbers and train robbers from Missouri. But when they had a judge murdered down in Waco, Texas, they were the ones who volunteered and were deputized as a posse to go out and hunt down the murderers and bring them to justice. So they wore the badge in our town, and then they'd get a letter or a telegram from Tennessee saying, hey, guys, you want to go back and make some more money? And then they'd put down their badges and go right back to murdering and robbing up there in Missouri. So the Wild West could be a wild place. Ultimately, Jesse James will meet his end being shot in the back in front of his family. When the government's trying to hunt him down, they paid off one of his gang members who was afraid Jesse might know, and before Jesse could kill him, he pulled out a gun and shot Jesse in Jesse's own home. These guys often live by the gun, they die by the gun. Billy the Kid, one of the most famous outlaws of all, there he is right there, he was a young cowboy on a ranch that ended up on the losing end of a cattle war. 2 ranches went to war, started murdering each other. Both sides actually got deputized by different lawmen, but he was on the losing side. Therefore, he was branded a criminal. The thing that really makes Billy the Kid famous is he makes his escape. After he's arrested by Sheriff Pat Garrett and put in jail, Garrett goes out to try to capture other members of the gang, and Billy's left with 2 deputies. And somehow Billy got a gun, shot one of the deputies, and then when the other deputy came running towards the jail, he had grabbed that deputy's shotgun and shot him too and made his escape. Eventually, Pat Garrett hunted Billy down to a ranch where he was hiding, and while Pat Garrett at night was inside the ranch house, in the rancher's room, asking the rancher, "Hey, have you seen Billy the Kid?" Billy was up that night trying to get himself a little snack. He heard somebody in the ranch house, stuck his head in the room, said, "Who's there?" And Pat Garrett says he recognized the voice, pulled his gun, and shot him in the dark. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. Finally, just one other famous one. This guy right up here with the long panhandle mustache is Wyatt Earp. Right next to him is his good friend Doc Holliday, a famous gambler. Earp and his brothers often dabbled in the law, and sometimes they dabbled on the other side. They may have been involved in a few little incidents of cattle theft, possibly. But they were often lawmen, and eventually his family moved down to Tombstone, Arizona, and became the lawmen, where they ran into a problem with some of the local cowboys who may have been stealing cattle. And bad blood grows between the Clantons and McLowrys and the Earps. And eventually what happens is when some of the Clantons and McLowrys were in town to pick up their brother who had been drunk and arrested, they had guns. And the thing is, in these Wild West towns, usually guns were illegal. Lawmen that were smart would get the town to put a ban on guns where you had to check your gun at the edge of town with the deputy and pick it up when you left. Well, that was the way it was in Tombstone. And when they heard that these guys might be armed, they went down to the OK Corral where these guys were actually getting their horses and leaving town. And they went to confront them and take their guns. And only 2 of the 5 cowboys actually had guns at this fight. And there were 4 of the others. Earp and his brothers, Doc Holliday, there were 4 of them, and they were all armed. It wasn't really a fair fight, but they went down there, ordered them to turn over their weapons and surrender, and immediately one of them went for their gun. And in the end, when the smoke cleared, the only one left that hadn't been shot was Wyatt Earp himself. His brothers and Doc Holliday were all lightly wounded and survived, and the cowboys, most of them were dead. So it was a famous gunfight, and this is the kind of thing that happened in the Old West. But it wasn't usually like it was in the movies where it's some kind of fair fight and you call the guy out in the street and have this duel. Instead, it usually was just plain gun violence like you still see today. Now, the other side of the Old West is the Indian Wars. Throughout the push west, as settlers are encroaching on the land, the Indians are losing their hunting grounds, their territory. And the government's answer all along has been to try to force Indians into what was labeled Indian Territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma, and to get them to settle on a reservation. Well, we had done that with the Indians back east, but now the last groups of Indians still holding on to their way of life, the most primitive, in fact, the Plains Indians, who hunted buffalo and lived in tents and followed the buffalo as nomads, just like people 20,000 years ago had done when they first came to the Americas. They were still holding on that way of life. But that was hard to do as people were taking up the land and killing off the buffalo. And of course, we were intentionally trying to civilize the land. So our cultures are clashing. In a modern America, there's not a place, apparently, for the natives to try to hold on to their way of life. So this is going to lead to that final series of Indian Wars. Now, the natives had gotten a break. During the Civil War, Americans went back east to kill each other. And so there was a slowdown in the push westward during the war itself. However, during the war, some of the Indians saw this as an opportunity to fight back and take back some of their land. And so across the West, there were clashes with settlers, and troops were sent out to try to tame the hostile Indians and defeat them and force them to reservations. And so in Colorado, the governor sent out not a really professional general, a guy who had gotten his position as during the Civil War. He had actually been a minister. A fellow by the name of Shivington and a bunch of volunteers who were not really well-trained soldiers. These guys were sent to go hunt down the hostiles. What they found was Chief Blackkettle's camp. Unfortunately, Blackkettle was not in the right location, but he did believe he was living peacefully. He didn't have warriors that were on the warpath. He was flying an American flag over his teepee. He believed he was at peace with us. But when they found his camp, as far as they were concerned, every Indian's the same, and he's hostile, and they're going to attack. And they did. And it was brutal. All the Indian wars were brutal. We didn't fight the same way they did. They aren't going to line up in fancy uniforms with regimental bands and flags and meet us in a field to kill each other like civilized men. The way they fight is they find our settlers, or when they were fighting with each other, find another enemy camp that's encroaching on their territory, and a few warriors would ride in, kill a few people, kidnap a few people, steal a few things, and intimidate their Indians and drive them back. That's how they did warfare. Our form of warfare is send armies into the field and fight each other. And so what ends up happening, since we don't fight the same way, is they attack our settlers, men, women, and children, often defenseless in little homes on the frontier, and horrible things happen. But then that's the same thing we do to them. Our army marches around to find them, and we find their homes, teepees, with Indians in them, men, women, and children, often defenseless, and horrible things happen. But what happened at Sand Creek was worse than all the others, because Chivington and his men went so far beyond what was considered civilized that Chivington is going to be court-martialed. They butchered men, women, children, babies. They brought back scalps and other souvenirs made out of the Indians they had killed and sold them in Denver. It was such an outrageous thing that Americans were incensed by it, and so were the Indians across the whole frontier. And so all across the frontier, the Indian wars flare up. And the Civil War's closing, and Americans want the wars to be over, and they want their boys to come home. But now the U.S. is having to send soldiers out west to fight Indians. Well, as settlers are moving along the trails heading west at a place called Fort Phil Kearny, we had a fort to try to protect settlers. And Red Cloud, a leader of the Sioux, organized his warriors, focused them in a way that we had never seen before, and he made targeted attacks repeatedly on the fort, eventually caught a group of foolish soldiers led by Fetterman that disobeyed orders, and they left the vicinity of the fort to chase the Indians into a trap, and they ended up in a valley, 80 of them, surrounded by over 1,000 warriors, because they had went right into the trap, and they were massacred. After this defeat, the U.S. kind of pulled back and said, well, we don't want a protracted Indian war. Things aren't going well. And for the only time in history, the U.S. government loses the Indian war, makes a treaty on the Indians' terms. We gave them larger areas that were theoretically supposed to be their reserved lands. We made them promises of what we would give them on the reservations, extra meat, extra supplies, so they didn't have to rely as much on hunting. We promised to stay out of the sacred Black Hills, the hills that eventually we will carve our president's faces into. But to the Indians, those were sacred hills, and we promised we'd stay out of there. The Indians won. We closed those forts. They burnt those forts. And the Treaty of Fort Laramie guaranteed all of these things. And on the southern plains, we had a similar treaty with southern Indians like Comanches and Kiowas, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek. However, it didn't take too long before violence flared again. On the southern plains, as the buffalo hunters were now going out and slaughtering the buffalo because there was profit to be made by selling buffalo robes, and the government encouraged it because it was killing the Indians' food source, forcing them to rely on reservations. A chief right here, Quanah Parker, the son of a little Texas girl who had been captured by Comanches, grew up Comanche, married a Comanche chief. He's going to be the last great war chief of the Comanches, and he organizes the Indians, and they make an attack at a buffalo hunters camp called Adobe Walls, a little tiny village with just a buffalo hunting store and a saloon there. Unfortunately for them, although there was only 30 buffalo hunters that 500 Indians were attacking, it was a sporting goods store. It was a buffalo hunting store, and the hunters retreated in there where they had unlimited guns and ammunition. So they couldn't win this battle, but that didn't stop them. Then they went out on the plain, found 5 or 6 hunters doing their business, and butchered them. and left them as a warning to others and went on and did that again and again. And the army was sent out to stop the hostiles. And the battle that will do that and end the Comanche Nation forever is the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. One unit of the U.S. Army found the Indians where they were spending the winter down in Palo Duro Canyon, a place they thought they would never be found, a place they thought they would be safe. And the army attacked the village, cutting the Indians off from their horses, which is how Comanches fight and hunt and do everything. And the most decisive battle ever between the army and a group of Indians, only a small handful of people die. The Indian warriors fight long enough for their women, their children, their elderly to flee, and then they flee. But they leave behind them all their teepees, all their possessions, all of the food they had stored up for winter, and 2,000 horses. The army burnt everything and executed all the horses. The mighty Comanche Nation is now on foot and impoverished. They can't hunt. They can't fight because the horse was how they did everything. And the Comanche walked to the reservation. And the Indian wars on the southern plains end. On the northern plains, that same year, the wars are about to heat up as gold was discovered in those sacred Black Hills. And once somebody finds gold there, there's no keeping them out. So the U.S. Army tries to protect the gold hunters. But Indians who are being mistreated on the reservation are leaving for that reason. Others are angry because of the violation of the Black Hills, and they start attacking the miners. And so the army is sent in to force these Indians to submit. And an advanced unit of the army led by General George Armstrong Custer there found the Indian camp. And with 600 men, he thought he had enough to defeat them. Normally, that would be true because most Indian camps are 200 or 300 guys. But what had happened here is 8,000 Indians leaving reservations and preparing to go out onto the plains to hunt had temporarily gathered along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. And they were actually breaking camp, getting ready to split up into small groups. But Custer had found them before they broke up. And he attacked, and he found out that village was a lot bigger than he expected. And he and 200 of his men were wiped out. The biggest defeat that the U.S. Army ever suffered at the hand of native tribes. However, that didn't win the war for the Indians. Instead, we sent out the army to avenge Custer. We chased the Indians all summer. There really weren't any other major battles, but they couldn't hunt. They couldn't survive with us chasing them and with the buffalo disappearing. And so by the end of the summer, the tribes are mostly going to the reservation and giving up. Some, like Sitting Bull, would lead his people to Canada, but eventually would return to America and come to the reservation. So the Indian wars were over on the plains. Along the Mexican border, the Apache were still surviving by hiding in Mexico from U.S. troops. And then when the Mexican troops attacked, they hid in America. And they went back and forth. And the last chief to finally surrender will be Geronimo. Once he surrenders, the Indian wars end. But the Indians have one last hurrah, the ghost dance. It was a spiritual movement that spread across the country where Indians of all different tribes were doing prayers and dances as they were told by this particular religious leader. God was going to come back and save his Indian children. He was going to bring back the buffalo and bring back the spirits of their ancestors, and us Americans, we would be gone from the plains. Now, this was a spiritual movement, and they worshiped, they prayed, they danced for these things. But when lots of Indians are leaving the reservation, going out in the hills, with the goal of us, Americans, being gone, it scared the settlers to death. They're afraid they're going to come riding out of the hills. So the army was sent to go round up a group of these ghost dancers in Minnesota, near a place called Wounded Knee, and the Indians peacefully agreed to head back to the reservation with them. Unfortunately, that night they stopped to camp. The army went into the camp to round up any weapons the Indians might have. One Indian did not want to give up his gun. They struggled. The gun went off, and the army then massacred this group of Indians. So it's the last big bloodshed of the war, though it's really not a battle of any sort at all. It's just a sad incident. But at this point, the Indian fights are over. The native tribes have been forced to the reservation, where we will try to get them to assimilate into our culture. In fact, the Old West is over at this point. The land has been settled. So the Indians are on the reservation, and the Dawes Act breaks the reservations up into small plots of land where each native family can have their own farm rather than it just being a large reservation for the tribe. Now, the Dawes Act doesn't end up working, but it was an attempt to try to get them to learn to farm and be like us and be individuals rather than be a tribe. Eventually, they will, after about 15 years, change the rules and set up reservations along the terms that they are today, where many natives still live on reservations and tribes have certain autonomy on their tribal lands. But they're no longer roaming the plains. The settlers, the farmers, they now have the plains. And that means there's no more cattle drives, because the cattle drives would wreck their farms. And in fact, there's no need for them because the trains have come to Texas. So now you just drive the cattle right up the road. And barbed wire allows us to fence in large areas of the plains of Texas, making it possible to make ranches. And windmills will make it possible to pump water out of the ground so the cattle don't have to roam to the nearest stream. So the Wild West has been tamed, and the frontier is at an end.